On a November morning in 1924, the most powerful Irish gangster in Chicago died holding flowers. His murder in a shop filled with roses and chrysanthemums would spark 5 years of violence that culminated in one of America's most infamous crimes. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre. Picture Chicago in the early 1900s. The streets smelled of steel mills and stockyards, of immigrant cooking and spilled beer. In the shadow of new skyscrapers rising toward the clouds, children played in muddy alleys while their parents worked brutal hours in factories and slaughterhouses. This was a city of possibilities and desperation, where fortunes were made and lives were lost in equal measure. And in one of its most notorious neighborhoods, a boy named Charles Dean O'Banion was learning the rules of a world where survival meant being tougher, smarter, and more ruthless than everyone around you. Dean O'Banion was born on July 8, 1892, in the small town of Maroa, Illinois. His parents were Irish Catholic immigrants who had crossed an ocean, searching for something better than the poverty and persecution they'd left behind. But America, they discovered, had its own kind of hardship waiting for them. When Dean was just 9 years old, his mother Emma died of tuberculosis, a disease that ravaged poor neighborhoods where families lived packed together in cramped, airless rooms. The loss shattered their family. Dean's father, a house painter named Charles, gathered his sons and moved to Chicago, leaving Dean's sister Ruth with relatives downstate. They needed a fresh start, though what they found in Chicago was anything but fresh. The O'Banions settled in a neighborhood called Kilgubbin, though most people knew it by another name, Little Hell. The nickname wasn't poetic. This stretch of Chicago's north side was a place where poverty bred violence, where street gangs ruled corners and alleys, where children learned to fight before they learned to read properly. The neighborhood was predominantly Irish, filled with families like the O'Banions who had fled famine and oppression, only to find themselves trapped in a different kind of struggle. Young Dean, known to his friends as Deanie, sang in the choir at Holy Name Cathedral, his voice rising sweetly during Mass while his pockets were stuffed with whatever he'd managed to steal that week. Dean O'Banion wasn't born a criminal, he was shaped into one by the streets that raised him. In Kilgubbin, survival meant joining a gang or becoming a victim. Dean chose the former. He was a small kid with a sharp mind and sharper fists, and he quickly became known as someone who could handle himself in a fight. When he was young, riding on the back bumper of streetcars like many kids did for fun, a streetcar stopped suddenly and threw him to the ground. The car ran over his left leg, leaving it shorter than his right. For the rest of his life, Dean walked with a noticeable limp. Some people whispered behind his back, calling him Gimpy, but only once. Dean had a way of making sure insults weren't repeated. In his teenage years, Dean found his crew, the boys who would stay loyal to him until the very end. There was Earl Weiss, known to everyone as Jaime, a tough Polish kid with ice in his veins. Vincent Drucci, who earned the nickname the Schemer for his cunning plans, and George Moran, called Bugs because of his wild temper and unsettling stare. Together, they formed a bond that went beyond friendship. They were brothers forged in the fires of Little Hell, and they joined the Market Street Gang, a group that specialized in theft, burglary, and whatever else paid. The boys were good at what they did. They broke into stores, cracked safes, and mugged drunks stumbling out of taverns, but their real education came when they became sluggers. The newspaper wars of early 20th century Chicago were violent affairs that history has mostly forgotten or romanticized. Major papers like the Chicago Tribune and the Chicago Examiner hired gangs of young toughs to ensure their papers sold, and their competitors didn't. Sluggers would beat newsstand owners who sold rival papers, intimidate vendors, and sometimes engage in gunfights in saloons and on street corners. The job required brutality and loyalty, and Dean O'Banion had both. Through newspaper boss Moses Annenberg, Dean and his crew learned more than just how to hurt people. They learned how to operate in the shadows, how to read the angles, and how to make connections with men who had real power. They met political bosses who controlled Chicago's wards, men who needed muscle to intimidate voters and rig elections. The sluggers became enforcers, ensuring that the right people won and the wrong people learned to stay quiet. In 1909, Dean was arrested twice, first for safecracking, then for assault. He was convicted and spent time in a correctional institution, the only prison time he would ever serve. Something about those months behind bars must have taught him a lesson, though not the one the judges intended. Dean learned to be more careful, more calculated. He learned that getting caught was for amateurs. When he got out, he went back to his old life, but this time he was smarter about it. He worked as a singing waiter at McGovern's Liberty Inn, charming customers with his beautiful Irish tenor voice while his friends picked pockets in the coat room. The customers never suspected that the sweet-voiced young man entertaining them was drugging their drinks with Mickey fins and waiting to rob them when they stumbled into the night. But everything changed in 1920 when the United States government made a decision that would reshape American society and create a golden age for criminals. The 18th Amendment went into effect, and prohibition became the law of the land. Suddenly, the production, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages was illegal across the entire country. The government believed that banning alcohol would reduce crime, improve health, and strengthen families. Instead, it created the largest criminal enterprise in American history, and Dean O'Banion saw it coming before most people did. While politicians were still debating the details of enforcement, Dean was already making arrangements with beer suppliers in Canada. He struck deals with whiskey and gin distributors. He identified breweries that could operate in secret and speakeasies that would need product. When Prohibition officially began, Dean O'Banion was ready, and on December 19, 1921, he pioneered what became a Chicago tradition. The liquor hijacking. Dean spotted a truck loaded with alcohol parked on Chicago Street. He approached the driver, pulled out a roll of nickels, and knocked the man unconscious with a single punch. Then he simply drove away with the truck and sold its contents, bootleg whiskey worth $15,000, to saloon keepers across the city. It was brilliant in its simplicity and brutally effective. Dean's reputation grew fast. He and his crew, now calling themselves the North Side Gang, moved with precision and violence, eliminating competition and taking control of the bootlegging operations across Chicago's North Side and the wealthy Gold Coast neighborhood along Lake Michigan. They hijacked shipments, broke into distilleries, and once stole over $100,000 worth of Canadian whiskey from the railroad yards. At the height of his power, Dean O'Banion was making roughly $1 million a year from bootlegging alone, an astronomical fortune in 1920s money. He attracted more followers: Samuel Nails Morton, a tough Jewish gangster with connections, Louis Two-Gun Altery, who carried a pistol in each pocket, and handsome Dan McCarthy, who was exactly as charming as his nickname suggested. But Dean knew that money alone wasn't enough. He needed legitimacy, a front that would let him operate in plain sight. So in 1921, the same year he married his 18-year-old sweetheart Viola Caniff in a ceremony at Holy Name Cathedral, Dean bought a half-interest in Schofield's flower shop at 738 North State Street, directly across from the cathedral where he'd once sung as a choir boy. The location was perfect, symbolic even. William Schofield, known as Big Bill, had built a thriving business, and Dean used extortion to force his way into partnership. Schofield had little choice but to accept. The flower shop was more than just a front. Dean genuinely loved flowers. He had a passion for arranging them, a talent that seemed impossible to reconcile with his other life. He would spend hours in the back room of the shop, carefully selecting blooms and creating elaborate arrangements. His wife Viola said that Dean rarely came home without bringing her a bouquet, that despite his criminal activities, he was a devoted husband who always told her where he was going. The shop became wildly successful, and not just because of Dean's skill with flowers. Schofield's became the florist of choice for mob funerals, which were elaborate affairs in 1920s Chicago. When gangsters died, and they died frequently, their rivals would send enormous floral arrangements as shows of respect or mockery or both. Dean handled it all with professional grace, arranging thousands of dollars worth of flowers for men he might have ordered killed himself. But the flower shop served another purpose. The rooms above it became the headquarters of the North Side Gang. From this base, Dean coordinated deliveries of illegal alcohol disguised as floral shipments. He held meetings with suppliers and distributors. He counted money and planned operations. The shop allowed him to launder his bootlegging profits through legitimate flower sales. And the cathedral across the street meant that Dean and Jaime Weiss could attend daily mass, maintaining the appearance of good Catholic men even as they built a criminal empire. Despite his success, Dean O'Banion couldn't operate alone in Chicago. The city's bootlegging business was too large, too profitable, and too violent for any one gang to control entirely. So around 1921, Johnny Torrio, the head of the South Side Gang, called a meeting with all the major bootleggers. Torrio was older than most of them, a veteran gangster who had brought a young tough named Al Capone from New York to serve as his enforcer. Torrio argued that cooperation made more sense than constant warfare. If they divided Chicago into territories, each gang could operate without stepping on each other's toes. They could pool their political power, share profits from joint ventures, and present a united front against law enforcement. Dean agreed to the arrangement. The North Side gang would control the North Side and the lucrative Gold Coast. Torrio and Capone would run the South Side. A third group, the Jenner brothers, would control Little Italy west of downtown. To sweeten the deal, Torrio gave Dean a share of the bootlegging rights in Cicero, a suburb that Capone was transforming into a wide-open city of speakeasies and gambling dens. The gangs even shared ownership of a lakefront casino called The Ship, where Chicago's elite came to gamble away their fortunes. For a while, the arrangement held. Dean and Torrio maintained a cordial relationship, and the money flowed like the illegal liquor they were all selling. But peace between gangsters never lasts. The cracks began to show in 1924. The Jenner brothers, who were allied with Torrio and Capone, started selling their whiskey on the North Side, Dean's territory. Dean complained to Torrio, expecting him to enforce their agreement. Torrio did nothing. This infuriated Dean, who saw it as a betrayal. He began hijacking the Jenners' liquor shipments in retaliation, hitting them where it hurt most. The tension escalated when one of the Jenner brothers, Angelo, racked up a $30,000 gambling debt at the Ship. During a meeting to divide the casino's profits, Capone suggested they forgive the debt as a professional courtesy, a way to maintain good relations. Dean refused. He called Angelo Jenner and demanded payment in full within a week. It was a calculated insult, a way of asserting dominance and showing that Dean O'Banion didn't bow to anyone, not even the Sicilians. But Dean's biggest mistake, the one that would cost him his life, came when he decided to get out of the brewery business. Or at least that's what he told Torrio. Dean owned a share in the Seaburn Brewery, a major operation that produced thousands of barrels of beer. He approached Torrio and said he was tired of the bootlegging game, that he wanted to retire and focus on his flower shop. He offered to sell his share of the brewery to Torrio for $500,000, an enormous sum. Torrio agreed immediately. The deal was set, and Dean began making arrangements for one final beer shipment from the Seaburn Brewery. Torrio would take possession the night of the delivery. Except Dean had learned something that Torrio didn't know. The police were planning to raid the Seaburn Brewery. On the night of the final shipment, Torrio arrived at the brewery to oversee the transfer. The place was bustling with activity, trucks being loaded with barrels of beer. And then the police burst in. They arrested Torrio, Capone, and over 24 associates for violating the Volstead Act, the federal law that enforced prohibition. Dean O'Banion wasn't there. He had pocketed the $500,000 and vanished. Because Dean had no prior convictions for bootlegging, he couldn't be charged even though everyone knew he'd been a partner in the operation. But Torrio had a record. He was convicted and sentenced to 9 months in jail and fined $5,000. The double-cross was perfect and devastating. Dean had taken Torrio's money, destroyed his brewery, and put him in prison. Torrio realized too late that he'd been played by the Irish florist with the charming smile. The betrayal shattered any remaining peace between the North and South Side gangs. Torrio wanted revenge, but he was in jail. Capone, however, was free and furious. The Jenner brothers, already angry about the unpaid gambling debt and the hijacked shipments, demanded permission to kill Dean O'Banion. For months, Torrio had refused, knowing that killing Dean would start a war. But after the brewery scam, Torrio agreed. Dean O'Banion had to die. The only question was how to get close enough to do it. Dean was careful, always surrounded by bodyguards, always armed. But there was one place where he let his guard down, his flower shop. The plan came together after Mike Merlo, the president of the Unione Siciliana, died of cancer on November 8, 1924. Merlo had been a moderating influence in Chicago's underworld, someone both the Italian and Irish gangsters respected. His funeral would be a major event, and Dean O'Banion would handle the flowers. In the days after Merlo's death, several men visited Schofield's flower shop to discuss funeral arrangements. One of them was Frankie Yale, a gangster from New York who ran the Unione Siciliana nationally. Yale spoke with Dean about what kind of arrangements Merlo's family wanted, taking careful note of the shop's layout, where the doors were, where Dean worked in the back room. On the evening of November 9th, Dean received a phone call ordering a special wreath to be picked up the next morning. November 10th, 1924, started like any other day for Dean O'Banion. He arrived at the flower shop early, working in the back room among the chrysanthemums and roses. His bodyguard, Louis Alteri, had called in sick with a hangover, so Dean was alone except for the shop's porter. Around 11:30 in the morning, the bell above the shop door jingled. 3 men walked in. Dean looked up from the flowers he was clipping. He recognized Frankie Yale, one of the men who had visited to discuss Merlo's funeral arrangements. Dean smiled, wiped his hands on his apron, and walked toward them. "Hello, boys," he said. "You from Mike Merlot's?" Yale nodded and extended his hand. Dean reached out to shake it, and Yale gripped his hand tightly, pulling him close. The other two men, John Scalise and Albert Anselmi, Capone's most brutal assassins, drew their guns. The first two bullets hit Dean in the chest. Two more tore through his throat. He tried to pull away to reach for his own gun, but Yale held him in that death grip. Dean fell against the glass display case, flowers scattering around him. As he lay dying on the floor among the petals and stems, one of the killers fired a final shot into the back of his head. The three men walked out calmly, got into their car and drove away. The porter, who had witnessed everything, was too terrified to move. An 11-year-old boy who was helping children cross the street outside the cathedral heard the shots and saw three men run from the shop. He would later tell police that two of them looked like foreigners, though he couldn't identify them. Inside the flower shop, surrounded by the blooms he had arranged so carefully, Dean O'Banion lay dead at 32 years old. The funeral was unlike anything Chicago had ever seen. 20,000 people attended, filling the streets around the church. Politicians, judges, police officers, and gangsters all came to pay their respects. The casket was made of silver and bronze and cost $10,000, more than most working families earned in several years. Dean's body lay in state for 3 days, surrounded by thousands upon thousands of dollars worth of flowers. It took 26 trucks just to transport the flowers to the cemetery. Al Capone sent a simple basket of roses with a card signed Al Brown, used furniture dealer, his favorite alias. The funeral procession stretched for a mile through Chicago's streets, and 5,000 people gathered at Mount Carmel Cemetery to watch Dean be laid to rest. The Archdiocese of Chicago, however, refused to bury him in consecrated ground. Dean O'Banion had been a criminal, and the church would not sanctify his grave. Dean's death didn't end the violence, it unleashed it. Jaime Weiss took over the North Side Gang and immediately began planning revenge. He blamed Capone and Torrio for Dean's murder, and he was right. On January 20, 1925, Weiss and several gunmen ambushed Torrio outside his apartment. They shot him multiple times, hitting him in the jaw, chest, and groin. Torrio barely survived. When he recovered enough to speak, he made a decision that would reshape Chicago's criminal landscape. He handed control of the entire South Side operation to Al Capone and retired to New York. Torrio had seen enough of Chicago's gang wars. He was done, but Capone was just getting started. The violence escalated throughout 1925 and 1926. Jaime Weiss and his men launched a massive attack on Capone's headquarters in Cicero, firing more than 1,000 rounds into the building with machine guns. Innocent bystanders were hit, and the attack made headlines across the country. 3 weeks later, Capone's men ambushed Weiss in front of Holy Name Cathedral, right across the street from Dean's old flower shop. They killed him with machine guns, bullets tearing through his body and chipping the cathedral's cornerstone, damage that remains visible to this day. Vincent Drucci took over the gang after Weiss died, but he was killed by a police officer during a confrontation in 1927. Finally, George "Bugs" Moran inherited control of what was left of the North Side Gang. He was the last of Dean's original crew still alive, and he was determined to keep fighting. Bugs Moran was a different kind of leader than Dean had been. Where Dean had charm and business sense, Moran relied on brute force and his terrifying temper. He continued hijacking Capone's liquor shipments, disrupting the South Side's operations at every opportunity. The feud between the two gangs had cost dozens of lives and millions of dollars. Capone, now the undisputed boss of Chicago's South Side and one of the most powerful criminals in America, decided to end it once and for all. He would eliminate Moran and destroy what remained of the North Side Gang in a single devastating strike. The plan would be the most audacious, brutal attack in Chicago gang history, and it would happen on Valentine's Day. On February 14, 1929, 7 men gathered in a garage at 2122 North Clark Street. It was a cold Thursday morning, and the men were waiting for a shipment of bootleg whiskey from Detroit. 5 of them were members of Moran's gang, brothers Peter and Frank Gusenberg, Albert Weinshank, Adam Heyer, and Albert Kashilek. The other 2 were John May, a mechanic who worked in the garage, and Reinhard Schwimmer, an optician who liked hanging around gangsters. Bugs Moran was supposed to be there too, but he was running late. At 10:30, a black Cadillac that looked like a police car pulled up outside the garage. 2 men dressed in police uniforms and 2 men in civilian clothes got out and entered the building. The men inside the garage weren't worried. Police raids were common, and the standard procedure was simple. Line up against the wall, get searched, maybe pay a fine, and everyone goes home. So when the men in uniforms ordered them to face the wall with their hands up, they complied. They had no idea what was about to happen. The two men in civilian clothes pulled out Thompson submachine guns, weapons that could fire 600 rounds per minute. The men in police uniforms held shotguns, and then they opened fire. 70 rounds tore through the 7 men in seconds. Bullets ripped through their heads, chests, and stomachs, spraying blood across the concrete floor and the brick wall behind them. When the shooting stopped, the killers walked out calmly, the men in civilian clothes pretending to be arrested by the men in uniform. Witnesses who saw them leave assumed the police had conducted a raid. No one suspected it was a massacre. When real police arrived at the scene, they found 6 dead men and one, Frank Gusenberg, barely alive. He had been hit 14 times but was still breathing. The police asked who shot him. Gusenberg looked up at them and said, "Nobody shot me." He died 3 hours later without saying another word. The code of silence held even in death. The garage looked like a slaughterhouse. Bodies lay twisted among scattered tires and shell casings. Blood pooled on the concrete. The only survivor was John May's dog, a German shepherd who had been chained in the corner and had watched the entire killing. The St. Valentine's Day massacre shocked America. Newspapers across the country ran front-page stories with gruesome photographs of the bodies. The public was horrified by the brutality, by the realization that gangsters could commit mass murder in broad daylight and walk away. The massacre accomplished Capone's goal of destroying the North Side Gang as a serious threat, but it also destroyed Capone's own reputation. He had been seen by many as a modern-day Robin Hood, a charming rogue who provided people with the alcohol the government had foolishly banned. After the massacre, he became public enemy number 1. Federal authorities, including the newly powerful FBI, made Capone their top target. President Herbert Hoover personally ordered that Capone be brought down, and the government threw all its resources into investigating him. Ironically, they couldn't get Capone for the massacre. There wasn't enough evidence to charge him. But in 1931, federal agents finally found something that stuck: tax evasion. Capone had never filed income tax returns on his illegal millions. He was convicted and sentenced to 11 years in federal prison. His empire crumbled. He served time in Alcatraz, and when he was finally released, he was a broken man, his health destroyed by syphilis. He died in 1947 at just 48 years old, his mind ravaged by disease. Bugs Moran survived the massacre only because he arrived late that morning. When he saw what he thought was a police car outside the garage, he turned around and went to a coffee shop. His tardiness saved his life, but it didn't save his gang. The North Side operation never recovered. Moran tried to continue, but without the money and manpower Dean O'Banion had built, he couldn't compete. The Chicago outfit, Capone's organization, absorbed most of the North Side territory. Moran eventually left Chicago, drifting from city to city, getting arrested for petty crimes. He died in prison in 1957, a forgotten man who had once ruled half of Chicago. The Irish mob's golden age in the city died with Dean O'Banion in that flower shop. The story of Dean O'Banion seems impossible when you think about it. A choir boy who became a killer. A florist who ran bootlegging operations worth millions. A man who attended mass every morning and ordered murders every afternoon. But that contradiction was quintessentially American, especially in the Chicago of the 1920s. This was a city and a country trying to define itself, caught between old world values and new world ambitions, between the law and the lawless, between the American dream and the American nightmare. Dean O'Banion represented something larger than just one gangster. He was the story of Irish immigrants who came to America seeking freedom and found only poverty and prejudice. He was the story of neighborhoods like Little Hell, where survival meant violence and loyalty meant everything. He was the story of Prohibition, that grand experiment in moral reform that created the largest criminal enterprise in history and made gangsters into folk heroes. Dean lived in a time when the line between criminal and businessman was razor-thin, when politicians were as corrupt as the criminals they pretended to chase, when a man could make $1 million and still die in a flower shop with a bullet in his head. What haunts me most about Dean's story isn't the violence or the betrayal or even the waste of human life. It's the flowers. Throughout everything, the murders, the bootlegging, the gang wars, Dean never stopped loving flowers. His wife said he brought her bouquets. His friends said he genuinely cared about creating beautiful arrangements. In the chaos and brutality of his life, flowers were the one pure thing he touched. And it was among the flowers that he died, surrounded by chrysanthemums and roses, their petals falling around him like snow. In his final moments, did Dean think about the boy he'd been, singing in the cathedral choir across the street? Did he wonder how that innocent kid became the man bleeding out on a flower shop floor? We'll never know, but the flowers remember. They remember the Irish gangster who arranged them with gentle hands in the morning and ordered killings with those same hands in the afternoon. They remember the man who tried to be two people at once and failed at being either. And every November 10th, when the world celebrates something else entirely, those flowers remember the day Chicago's bloodiest gang war began in a shop that smelled of roses and death.